I usually really like Vassy Kapelos from CTV News, but I don't know if I do anymore.
But it also contributes, to the emissions, the overall emissions. It's 30%.
Maybe this was just a slip. Maybe this was just a stupid question. I don't know. But either way, Danielle Smith absolutely destroys her with nothing else but common sense and facts. I'm Jasmine Lane, and welcome back to another episode of Over Opinionated. And I guarantee not only will you learn a lot, there's a lot of things that are going to be debunked here. So maybe you can pass that on to some of your left-leaning friends or family members. Help me feel important and subscribe to the channel. You can also like the video and comment your thoughts down below.
Former Liberal Finance Minister Bill Morneau there calling on the federal government to consider delaying its emissions cap on the oil and gas sector. Why? The imminent return of Donald Trump to the White House. He says Ottawa should be focused on policies that better align Canada with the incoming administration. His comments were welcomed by Alberta Premier Danielle Smith, who has long been a vocal critic of Ottawa's plans to regulate the sector. But when I put Morneau's comments this week to Energy Minister Jonathan Wilkinson, he rejected the idea of a delay outright. With me now to talk more about this is Alberta's Premier Danielle Smith. Hi, Premier. Good to see you as always. Thanks for making the time.
You bet. Thanks, Vassy.
I wanted to start off on that cap because you have been opposed to it from the start. The federal government says bending on it now would throw their climate plan into jeopardy, even when the new administration south of the border is taken into account. Don't they have a point there?
No, they don't, because their climate plan is already in jeopardy. In fact, the Auditor General released a report saying that Canada is nowhere near on track to meet their 2030 targets and that the carbon tax doesn't work. They also confirmed that you do not get more money than you pay back into carbon tax when you factor in everything else and not just the cherry-picked data when it comes to costs and the rising costs of everything, because so many businesses are offsetting their carbon tax costs and putting it onto consumers. In fact, the only people who do benefit in terms of carbon tax are people who are already living on or very close to the poverty line. So I don't know that that's really a huge talking point you want to brag about Trudeau, but nonetheless, he does.
No, they don't. I mean, not bending on some of the direction they've taken, it will jeopardize our relationship with the United States, which is the largest trading relationship that we have, not only Alberta, but all of our provincial counterparts. We know one of the things that the new White House wants is energy security. We have the ability to offer that. And if you put on the table an emissions cap, which we know will cause a cap in production, you're not going to be able to negotiate in a way that's going to be best for Canada. So if they want to have a Team Canada approach, it means the emissions cap has to be off the table.
On top of that, Stephen Guilbeault released earlier this week that they are planning to extend the carbon tax, the same one that was proven to be ineffective and also acknowledged to be ineffective by the UN, as Canada at that last UN climate summit, COP29, was actually dead last on the list of countries that are actually doing anything to stop their emissions. But nonetheless, Stephen Guilbeault wants to make more money for his businesses, and why wouldn't he? He's on his way out the door and clearly does not care about Canadians or have any loyalty to anybody but himself. And the feds announced that they are now going to be including a carbon tax on all imports from countries that do not have one, which is basically every country. So yeah, that's gonna really help our economy, idiot.
How do you know for certain that it would amount to a production cap? You've been critical of the impact of climate policies levied so far by the federal government, and yet this year there are record exports to the United States of oil and gas, and there are oil specifically, I should say, and there is also a record level of production of that. So how do you know for sure that what the federal government is proposing, which by the way is even on the low end of what they had floated a number of months ago, is necessarily going to be a production cap?
I usually like Vassy. I do. I think she's intelligent. She's very articulate. I'm still not 100% sure what side she's on. She seems to be rather center, perhaps slightly right-leaning. But this question right here is dumb. I'm sorry to say that because I do have a lot of respect for her. But how do you know for certain that this emissions cap is going to be a productions cap? Well, possibly the simple fact that in order to produce things, we do not yet have the technology to have zero emissions when we do it. So if you have an emissions cap at this point in time, that means that you're gonna have to cease production.
Well, it's because you have to wait for the technology to develop. And one of the ways in which our industry is going to decarbonize is by rolling out small modular reactors. We know that the time frame for developing the regulatory environment and getting those implemented is no sooner than 2035. So if you set targets for 2030, and 2035, the only way to reach them, if you don't have the technology on emissions reduction, is to shut in production. It's really just simple math. What we have always been advocating for is give industry the time frame that they need, which they say is 2050, so that we have time to develop the technology, implement the technology, develop out carbon capture, utilization, and storage, build that pipeline infrastructure, bring in new types of power sources. You can't do that with the snap of a fingers. You certainly can't do that within the short time frame that they've talked about. And so the only option is a production cap, and we'll be fighting that every step of the way.
To that point, there is some flexibility, some compliance flexibility built into the plan. And beyond that, again, when you talk about all the technological development, you're taking industry's word for how long it's going to take. Ultimately, if they don't develop the technology, then the alternative for them is to cut production. But isn't that on them?
Well, I would say that we have to work on a timescale that operates in the real world. We know that carbon capture, utilization, and storage does work. We've already safely stored 14 megatons of CO2 emissions. But we also know that it takes a long time with permitting and approval, with Indigenous consultation, with landowner consultation, and the timescales for getting things built. That can't be done in 5 years. Everyone knows that.
That's another really important thing to note too, is the Trudeau government always puts these deadlines and they have all these plans and they force you to comply with things. But in those same plans, they also fail to acknowledge the fact that the regulation and bureaucracy that they have put in as a government makes it impossible to reach the targets that they set out. And so then when you don't meet a certain target, regardless of what it's particularly about, they will shame you and they will call you out and they'll use it as oh, well, you didn't do this. And it's like, yeah, you knew that that was impossible. You literally set us up for failure and then chastised us for failing. Like, you are a high school bully. You knew that wasn't going to happen. You knew it wasn't possible. And you're not being reasonable in terms of coming to a solution that does make sense and is possible. Why are you doing this to us? Like, that is such a cruel way to treat people and to try to grandstand. You want them to fail and you know that they're going to fail, but you think that you look good to stupid people who don't read in between the lines and see what you're doing there.
And so I think that the reason why the federal government has put forward such aggressive targets is because they want to sell it to the public as an emissions cap, knowing full well it is a production cap and it's a violation of the Constitution. And that's why we will continue to fight against it.
Is there a chance, though, that they are actually trying to ensure that those companies that you reference, that industry that you reference, actually does more than pay lip service to reducing emissions? I mean, the oil patch is a huge economic boon to this country. There is no way I would take away from the contribution that it makes to the Canadian economy. But it also contributes, to the emissions, the overall emissions. It's 30% of all the emissions in this country. If you slow down the process of reducing those emissions, how can you say that you're really about fighting the effects of climate change?
Here's the thing, again, that just I'm undecided how I feel about Vassy going forward now, because I thought she was a good one, and then she says things like this, and I'm like, are you though? Do you actually believe in this crazy stuff that you're forced to talk about and take a side on? I don't know. Because she says there, 30% of emissions in Canada. Well, Canada only contributes to approximately 1.5 to 2% of global carbon dioxide emissions annually. 1.5 to 2%. That's it. And the oil sector is 30% worth of the 1.5 to 2%. Climate activists will always argue me on this, where they'll say, Canada is one of the top 10 emitters per capita. And I'm like, yeah, we have a tiny population in comparison. Being one of the top 10 emitters per capita doesn't mean anything. You're still only emitting 1.5 to 2% globally. And we have winter. And we have really hot summers.
Look, if they wanted to show me they were serious, they would say that they're, as part of declaring their climate emergency, they are going to fast track the approvals on developments. They would give the money to build the pipeline so it could be done in 1 year. They would assist us in developing a regulatory environment so that we could roll out small modular reactors in 2 years. I'm not hearing any of that discussion. They aren't interested in changing the regulatory approval process. They aren't interested in working with us on streamlining some of those approvals. If we wanted to fast track things so that they could have a faster implementation, then I'm sure the industry would work with them. But what they're asking the industry to do is the impossible. Is that they're asking them to go through a regulatory process that they know will take decades and then meet these emissions targets within 5 years. And the only way to do it is a production cap. That's why we have been fighting against it. We've said if we need to have the longer time frame to unfold this, then give a longer time frame so that we have the ability to continue doing our production.
Don't get me wrong, I do like Pierre Poilievre, but I really hope Premier Danielle Smith at some point in time runs as Prime Minister for Canada. That would be amazing. She is so unbelievably smart. That was mic drop after mic drop. Like, she knows what she is talking about, and she might be one of the only provincial leaders who truly has a Canada First approach. I'm Jasmine Lane, and thank you for hanging out with me and watching another episode of Over Opinionated. If you liked it, you can help me feel a little validated by hitting that subscribe button if you haven't already. And you can also like the video and share your comments down below.